Prodigal Son, one of the longer and certainly most well known of Jesus' parables. But today we want to look at what the Bible does not say about that famous son. Welcome to this episode of Pearls of the Interior Life. Very good to be with you as always. Thank you for making this time for the Lord. This Sunday brings us the parable of the prodigal son. And in a way, it's a terrible way to put it, but a little bit of a payoff, if you will, from the past few weeks, which have been very demanding. There's been a lot of renouncing and detaching and preparing. I had difficult New York client once back in my prior life. Difficult New York client. There's a redundancy for you. Always pushing for more. Always whatever the investigation was supposed to be. Can you look at one more thing? Whatever the analysis would be. Can you assess that as well? And, in the report, can you talk about this? Just always pushing for more. And you'd say, for all this money I'm spending, which from different perspectives wasn't all that much, but for all this money I'm spending, where's the salami? Where's the salami? I'm not going to try to do a New York accent. Where's the salami? Well, this Sunday we get the salami. Not everything Christ asks of us is the salami, is for our good. So the renouncing, the detaching, the preparing, every one of those things will enrich our life, will make us more human, will make us happy because we'll grow in holiness. That said, this week we kind of see the flip side of it. And this week we're reminded of God's infinite love, his infinite mercy, that he really does everything. It's just up to us. What Christ is asking of us in the past few weeks is just to turn to God, to give our will to him. But again, in this wonderful parable of the prodigal son, we do see that really it's God going all the distance. Now, our title is a little tongue-in-cheek, of course, what the Bible doesn't say about the prodigal son. The Bible tells us everything that we need to know about mercy and forgiveness, but obviously not all the details of the story of the prodigal son are given. And so we're going to reflect on that a little bit in this session, especially just as a lead-in for thinking deeper about forgiveness and mercy. They're not the same things. And that's going to be our main focus, preparing for this weekend, preparing for the Sabbath, preparing for Sunday, and then how do we carry that with us into the following week? First, what happens to the prodigal son? I always get a kick out of this. You probably do as well in movies. Movies, by necessity, they focus on the great drama, the great tension, but don't show what happens all the rest of the time. What happened after Luke Skywalker finishes saving the galaxy? Well, obviously, decades later, we got the sequels, and they're supposed to tell us what happened. But in the first movies that came out, okay, when he gets rid of the Emperor and everything is saved, what happens then? What is Luke Skywalker doing on the average Tuesday afternoon? That was one good thing. The old movie, The Graduate, not a great movie, don't recommend it. It has that horrible kind of movie-making sensibility of its time. But one great scene at the very end, after the big drama, and at the wedding, the bride at the altar leaves the groom and runs off with Dustin Hoffman, the man she really loves, and there's all the emotion and so on. Well, okay, great. And what happens then? The closing scene is just the two of them sitting on a bus. All right, what do we do now? Now we have the whole rest of life to fill in. Or in the first Avengers movie, I think these days all the storylines have gone woke and garbage. The first movie wasn't bad. At the very end, after the Avengers are done saving the world, it's just this very amusing scene of them all eating lunch. And okay, so what happens after the big denouement? And that's what we can wonder with the prodigal son. It's great at that moment that the story leaves us with, where he has a ring on his finger and a robe and sandals, and he's eating the fatted calf. Great. Sure. Who doesn't love that part of it? What comes after that, though? A day after, a week after, a month, years. Where we leave off in the story, he's essentially going to be an indentured servant to his brother, the prodigal son. He squandered all of his inheritance. Everything that's left is the brother's. Will he be satisfied with that? Is he going to want to renegotiate that deal? We don't know. We don't know how that plays out. We don't know how well he is able to accept the mercy and forgiveness of the Father, or what the brother does, or the Father, to the extent that the Father is a type of God the Father. His mercy and forgiveness will be perfect. To the extent that, he was just a real human being living in time, who knows, maybe he gets fed up with the prodigal son after a while. And this brings us to the point of today, though. The prodigal son is a story about forgiveness and mercy. We're going to start with the forgiveness side of it. And yes, we're invited to enter into the story, as you've probably done. We can enter in and put ourselves in place of the prodigal son, or of the father, or of the kind of snitty older brother, or of the fatty calf, if you want. It's your meditation time. But perhaps this weekend, looking even deeper on the concept of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a funny grace. It benefits both ways. So if we're doing the forgiving, for example, we benefit from the peace that comes out of letting go of that rancor, that poison that we would otherwise have in our system. Obviously, on the other side, if we're receiving the forgiveness, then we're benefiting from that absolution, from otherwise being held accountable for whatever the offense may have been. But I think we've all seen forgiveness done poorly on both sides of it. We've been forgiven poorly when we know the person forgiving us, their heart isn't really in it. There isn't truly a forgiveness. There isn't a release of whatever is felt is owed, or whatever that offense is against them. Or likewise, if we've forgiven people, we've seen that not be ideal, either in our own heart or in the person that we're forgiving, when they're not truly repentant and receiving of it. Not that our forgiveness is dependent on that, but we know that leaves the situation wanting, especially if we desire the best for them. And this brings us to what we want to think hard about, which is why. Why does God want us to forgive? And certainly the prodigal son is a story of God's forgiveness for us, and that's probably where we'll close. But why is it so important for us to forgive? Why is so much contingent on that in the Our Father, to forgive us as we forgive others? Jesus tells us, 70 times 7, that there's no limit. There's no limit. You have to keep forgiving. And that gets really to the heart of it, of the why, because everything is contingent on forgiveness. Forgiveness is the only way out of this mess of the fallen world, of our fallen humanity. God's forgiveness of us. That is step one. That is, do not pass go and collect $200 if you don't get forgiveness. That's why it was so scandalous when Christ came to earth and said, I'm here to forgive sins. That is it. That is the whole enchilada right there, starting with the forgiveness. Well, that's fine. That's God's prerogative to forgive us, but God, being God, desires us to share in that. Why? Because we're made in the image and likeness of God, and to forgive is divine. Mother Teresa says, you cannot learn to love if you don't start with forgiveness. Of course, there's the Oscar Wilde cynical end of it, of, always forgive, nothing frustrates your enemies more, or something to that effect. And Hannah Arendt, who's more and more in the social consciousness these days, political philosopher from the World War II era, says that forgiveness is the beginning of action and freedom. Until there is something deep in the human nature, until we release ourselves of being bound, again, by that rancor and anger, we can't move on to the higher callings of our life. And yet God knows us best of all. So he knows that this is foundational. Christ, where do we start? Repent and believe. That forgiveness, in that case, receiving forgiveness, is where we start. And so we're called to become experts in forgiveness. What else can possibly happen if you do it 70 times, 7 times practically a day? Whatever you do, if you do it repeatedly and giving the best of yourself to it, you will become expert at it. And that's what God is asking us to do here. Just a short list of the many things that come from this. First, we're being given the opportunity to put ourselves in God's position when we're invited to forgive others. Wow, okay, this is what it feels like to be God. And like the father of the prodigal son, we come to learn that our forgiveness doesn't depend on the disposition of the person we're forgiving. The prodigal son, he wasn't particularly repentant. He was hungry. He didn't come home because he longed for his father. He came home because he wanted something to fill his belly. Father forgives him anyway. It doesn't depend on the prodigal son. Yes, he had some nice words to say. I have sinned against you in heaven, but his intentions weren't pure. And yet the father certainly probably had a sense of that and a longing for that, as do we when we forgive someone and they're not completely repentant. Well, at first it may just sting, because we're thinking, well, I don't want to forgive you. But as we grow in it, ideally it gets to a point where it stings because we desire more for them. We want them to be truly repentant because it's important for them, not for us anymore. Because if we're forgiving them as best as we're able, we're forgiving them in God. We're doing it through God, with God. Yeah, and that's really the source of the resolution in our own heart. It's not dependent on them. It's really about our relationship with God at that point. And then on the other side, it puts us in a much more empathetic place when we're seeking forgiveness. We can bear with it better when people don't forgive us perfectly, because we recognize they're not divine, they're human as well. And we can desire to be better penitents ourselves, to be truly repentant for our sins, to accept the consequences. And at the risk of going the pop psychology route, one of the most important things actually is to learn to forgive ourselves. And now we're sitting on both sides of it. We're the forgiver and the forgivee. But much of what we suffer in life is just from our own failings, our own unforced errors. And it can be easy to have kind of a misdirected frustration with that. St. Teresa of Avila, she teaches that a lot of our frustration in life comes from expecting ourselves to be more than we are. No, I shouldn't have made that mistake. That shouldn't have happened to me. And often we'll redirect it. We'll still blame it on the universe or on God or on others. But deep down, we're thinking, I should have done better. I don't deserve this, or so on. And if we look at things critically, a lot of times we may well have deserved what came our way, or at least participated in it. And being able to simply forgive ourselves and put the past behind us is one of the best things that we can do just for our spiritual maturity. So there's all kinds of ways to enter into this, looking really deeper at forgiveness itself and where we are in that spectrum of maturity with forgiveness. And this brings us to the final point of the distinction of mercy. Forgiveness is step one. It is mandatory. We don't get it without God's forgiveness. That's it. It's hopeless. And then step number one for us of becoming fully human ourselves and healing our disordered self is forgiveness on our part, forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others. But again, that's just the beginning. This is where, back to Mother Teresa, who says, if you want to truly be able to love, you start with forgiveness, but we move then to love. Here is mercy from the Catechism. Mercy is loving kindness, compassion, or forbearance shown to one who offends. So again, this is going beyond just the forgiveness. This is what we see in the father of the prodigal son, that the forgiveness isn't contingent on the mindset of the prodigal son, but there's something contextually even deeper in words that aren't spoken of, just desiring the highest and best. That is what we're working towards. That's where forgiveness leads us. To forgive is divine. Yeah, absolutely. It certainly, especially in the sense that forgiveness, the Catechism also tells us, is a manifestation of God's power, of his omnipotence. Only God can forgive. We just share in that in our own little way. So to forgive is divine, absolutely. But to be merciful, I'd suggest, is to become divine. When we get to that point, that is the heart of the saints. Just about every saint, when you dig into their life, you'll find they have some story of extraordinary forgiveness. Not just ordinary human forgiveness, but extraordinary forgiveness of desiring the highest and best for the person they are forgiving. It is in that mercy that we truly become divine. So, in the week ahead, praying for you for the opportunity to, in this, deepen in your experience of forgiveness, of where God is calling you to grow, to become more like him, to forgive more like him, to become merciful more like him. Blessings to you on your journey with Christ.